Well, it doesn't seem that long ago that I was up here with Ed Blake, myself, making our first public presentation about what we would do in the park, along with Michael Rotundi. And at that time, Eric Fulford, who eventually became part of our team, was teamed with Roto, as we call him, and of course Charles Rose and Michael Van Valkenburg were the other team. And it was a real chance for us to kind of share our vision of how we might approach the park if we got the commission. And of course, we certainly were the dark horse in all of this. I had just sort of finished doing a stint guest teaching at MIT and had been asked by the museum to submit some of our portfolio work for consideration out of 40 or 50 architects, and then the list got narrowed to 25, and then narrowed to 15, and then narrowed to 5, and then narrowed to 3, and we kept scratching our heads like, you know, what is in the water here? Let me try. Let me see here. Whatever it is good. So maybe we could pop the first image up. Dave, there you go. It's awful bright up here, but I think I had the same problem last time I was here. So this is where I'm from. I'm from Northwest Arkansas, Fayetteville, Arkansas, home of the Ozarks. A place where culture, commerce, and agriculture and all intersect. Princeton Architectural Press did a book on us back in '05 on our work, and they wanted an iconic image of our place. So this is what we gave them. We had this idea that, you know, Ozarks are about valleys and hills and the intersection of that. And of course, Fayetteville is the only place in Arkansas that's actually in Northwest Arkansas is built on hills. So you can stand in downtown and look out and see cows and horses out into the fields. And so we thought, boy, that would be interesting to get down into a pasture, and we found this cow with a baby calf, and on the very top of this hill is the university, and that's Old Main, which is the most iconic building. And we said, this is it. Education, agriculture, Northwest Arkansas. We went to photograph it, and a Walmart truck drives right through the middle of it. And reminded us this, yes, we're also the capital of, in many ways, of commerce in the country as well. So all together, that's our place, and that's where I'm from. And so the idea of, finding an architect in what a lot of people like to call the boonies, a kind of relatively remote place, was something, a real thrill for us and a small victory. Of course, it is the land of Bill and a billion chickens. And that's kind of what we're known for, but we're also, I think, known, if you know the work of Edward Durrell Stone or Fay Jones, there's some really great post-war architecture that's kind of really unique, the concentration of it to this place. And where I live, of course, is filled with natural beauty. It's a very beautiful state, natural beauty, but also a place of real constructed ugliness. And so those are the things that we kind of work with where I'm from, working directly with nature and directly with what culture provides us in sometimes ideal ways and some ways more improvised ways. So, after our presentation that we made here, the board, and I may get the whole process and names wrong and all this tonight. I hope you'll forgive me. It's been a long time, but they couldn't make up their mind. So they came up with an idea that they would actually come visit each architect in their home place, look at their work firsthand, because there's no substitute for that, evaluate it, and see if there was a working relationship that they could have. And so they flew to Los Angeles to see Michael Rotundi, they flew to Boston to see Charles Rose, and they came to Arkansas to see us. And I was so excited. It's the first time I'd ever had a search committee come, and of course we were known for several buildings, but perhaps the one at the time most known for was the Keenan Tower House. And we had a whole day planned out. Everybody arrived. I think they left at 5 in the morning and arrived in the late morning. And I took them to a house we were working on for John Tyson, the CEO of Tyson Foods. He met the board and talked to them, and a clubhouse we were working on, some other projects. But I had scheduled the end of the day for this tower, a sunset on the tower catered, and my exhausted board, your board, came, and they got out of the car, and they looked up, and they went, oh, no. And it was 7 o'clock, and ushered everybody up, and Ed Fennell and Dot Fennell, one of the contributors at the time, of course, Susie Sogard, and I believe Mark Holcomb was part of that, and Anna, and any event, everybody's up there, and we're eating, and finally, Dot Fennell looks at me and goes, can we go now? And I go, excuse me? And says, I'm so tired and exhausted, and we have to leave tomorrow to go to New Orleans because they wanted to meet Ed Blake at the Crosby Arboretum in Picayune, Mississippi. And my heart just sank because she was indelicate about it and was ready to leave. And so everybody packed up and we all left, and I thought, boy, we have lost that commission. And I got up the next morning and they flew out. Well, I flew to Hattiesburg, Mississippi to meet Ed. Now, Ed Blake, many of you may or may not know, is 6'8". He wore rings on every finger, lizard skin cowboy boots, a beret. He was the Keith Richards of landscape architecture. And he was there. He met me at the airport in a seersucker suit. Of course, it's middle of the summer in Mississippi. He said, we're going to meet him at Crosby Arboretum about 45 minutes away. We ran to a barbecue joint. We bought barbecue. And he says, we're going to take him to church, my church. And my church is nature in this great pavilion that he had commissioned Faye Jones to do at Picayune. And so we sat out under there with the board, and Ed, who liked to talk about things in terms of eons, he always started about 10 to 20 million years ago to bring you up to date on the context that you were in. And he gave, well, that day he was a preacher with a mugshot. He gave the most impassioned plea for this relationship between nature, things nature made, things man made, and the promise of this park to bring us together, and a wonderful productive tension between these things, a resonance that could be established where the boundaries of art, architecture, landscape might be broken down somewhat, and we come out with a new experience, a new way of interpreting our relationship with the world. That, in a kind of nutshell, was sort of the philosophical spin he put on that, and I could just see in the faces of the board they were enraptured. And they went on through the tour of the Crosby Arboretum, and this left. A few weeks later, we got a call from the director at that time, Tony. I can't remember his last name. Thank you. Very nice fellow. And he said, Ed, we're really, really fond of you, and board likes Marlon, but they kind of like Charles Rose a little bit more. And they said, would you consider teaming up? And Ed Blake said, Marlon and I started as a team and we'll end as a team. It's me and Marlon or nobody. And so Tony went back and he came back and he said, all right, then it's you and Marlon. So together, that's how we move forward. So somebody took a risk, somebody believed just enough to give us the opportunity, who in many ways, both of us were relatively young practitioners, to see what we could propose for this place. So what I want to do tonight is talk to you a little bit about the grand vision, the things that were proposed, the process, and of course what's happened, but also what didn't happen. But as we know, there are many architects, I think, in the audience. Every project is a winding road, always moving forward, at times sideways, at other times backwards, but towards a directed end. And the beauty of all this is that I think something quite wonderful came out of it in terms of what we have today. So one of the things we were very fascinated was Paul Cézanne's quote, one must make an optic, one must see nature as no one has seen it before. And so this park, this city park in many ways, is a place that is really about, in many ways, the volatile relationship between land and water. It's a disturbed landscape. It's not pristine. I think many in the public, back when we made our presentation, thought this was pristine. It's full of invasives. It used to be a pasture. was a forest at one time, a pasture, and then became a quarry, and then a lake, and there's all this flooding, and it's a really wild, wonderful place with all kinds of micro or echo tones in the park. And we really wanted to tap into that. And part of the process that we proposed to the board in terms of getting selected was that we wouldn't draw anything for a year. We would just merely observe, document the site, work with environmentalists as a way to understand the processes and the phenomena of the site. And then we wanted to work with an artist, and we wanted to allow the artist to make the first formal move. So to turn upside down that relationship often between the architect and other members of an interdisciplinary team, where the architect is the one that makes the first move. We wanted the artist to do that. And they were quite fascinated with that as a process. So we came here, as many of you know, this is in an oxbow. And then, of course, the canal that runs through. I think everybody's aware of the breaching that occurs when the White River rises above the lake, breaches into here. Of course, there's a wetlands that's formed by the water coming here and then bouncing back off the loop, forms a small wetland here, and then, of course, breaches back over here. So, again, very volatile site. It's also at that juncture between how Indianapolis was developed originally in its grid and then the more turn of the century means of development, and the river's in a very critical spot. And of course, as we all know, it floods. I think there have been 3 100-year floods in the last 6 years on the site. And that's a lot due to, I think, rather indiscriminate development upstream that I think has really affected the river and the way it flows. Certainly, we wanted to be mindful of how we would engage the volatility of the site and how art would be placed and how we would develop an opportunity for experience and an opportunity for interpretation. Originally in the program, it was for that experience and interpretation to be in one structure. And we politely disagreed with that assumption. We felt that experience has to be unto itself, as does interpretation, that if you combine them, what you could wind up with is placards telling you what to think after you've seen something. And we've all, I think, been in visitor centers that do that for you, do the thinking for you. So we thought maybe there was a way to place them differently in the site. And of course, the site is 100 acres. And in fact, I'm only showing 100 slides tonight in honor of that. But if you take out the lake, it's only 61 acres of buildable land. But if you factor in the floodplain, the floodway, the canal easements, sewer easements, you have 0.67 acres to build on. So not difficult to find our site. And there were actually two. There was this little zone right in here, which was actually a mound, a refuse mound. Remember, this was a quarry at one time. It was a construction site, and it was filled with construction debris, a mound 25 feet high and 14 feet deep of junk and trash and debris. And the Cottonwoods had taken this over. And it's the highest elevation on the site. So that was one. And then the other is this little triangular wedge here where easements all kind of form a sort of zone. It's still in the floodplain, but it's in the woodlands with no particular view. Of course, on top of this mound, you do have an opportunity for view across the lake. And so we were trying to think about this idea of the experiential center being an extended threshold into the site, a way of experiencing phenomena, the air in particular ways, the wetness of things, light in a particular way. So it's not about talking to you, it's about a precognitive experience that it leads you into this place of nature-made and man-made things. And then the other site here, this would be on the mound, the experiential. The other site here would be more about interpretation, assessments, a respite in the woods, and perhaps even an apparition without a view that's internalized on itself. So, the site, the meadow, which was already given to us, and how we begin to respond to that. The artist that we discovered that was available to us to engage was Mary Miss. And Mary as many know, is a wonderful artist, environmental artist. There's some iconic work she did in the late 60s, early 70s that every architecture and student in architecture should know. She was basically, in many ways, a hero to Ed and I, and then the opportunity to work with her. And she already had an underfunded project here that she had been trying to get built, an elevated bridge that somehow would connect you from the museum into the park. But they just couldn't find the means to do it. So we came up with the idea that it's part of the park, even though it's across the canal. Let's make it, let's roll it in and see if we can't come up with the financing for it. So the museum loved that idea, and they got the three of us together, which was in the spirit of the original proposal. And we began to doing reconnoiter on the site for a year, in the wintertime, in the summertime, in the spring, when the floods were happening. And we found evidences of, where man and nature kind of come together, this sort of debris, concrete chunks and the trees springing up between them. This is on the mound, the debris mound, and brick chimneys, and all kinds of things that were sort of buried. It was like an archaeological zone in a way of debris. And so our thought was maybe there's a way that we could carve into that to kind of set you into that you would come in high but go low and find yourself out onto the site. And so we're not doing some crazy dance here. We're talking about architecture, but it looks like we're doing the hippie shake shake. So on your left is Ed Blake, and on your right is Mary Miss, and then myself trying to keep up with them. Always out on the site, talking together, thinking through this, flying to New York, Mary's studio in New York, in drawing, making models, clay, writing, everything we could just to sort of kind of prep ourselves for the moment that we would make that first critical move in Mark. And we began then a more immersive process once we began to develop proposals and so forth with the museum staff, Mark Zalonis, Lisa Fryman, Max Anderson, who had now come on board as the director, and who's expanded the vision. If you know Max, he's a big thinker. He took the vision of this being this little sort of pavilion or thing in the park, or lodge, whatever that people were thinking, and expanded it to be all-encompassing for the park and for what we would have as an experience. So these are very critical sessions. Eric Fulford, you see, contemplating, as he does, Mary, Ed, and the staff members, Chris and Chad. Unfortunately, this drawing is not doing very well, but we came up anyways with a scheme of pathway journeys around and through the park, in the particular ecotones. Mary began to develop her idea of the bridge, starting up here at the top of the ravine and moving down the ravine across the canal through the wetlands, and then our sort of carved out trench that we were proposing, a type of modern nymphaeum in the mound, and then of course connected to the Interpretation Center, which would be programmed with educational facilities and other sorts of spaces. So I'll just start real quickly with some images that Mary had come up with, this idea of being in the museum and peering through the glass and seeing the start of these multiple fork paths, all dealing with this idea of water, rivulets of water that would move along this elevated pathway. So you start on the land. In fact, you start in the land as it's carved out of the earth, as you see here. And the pathways are metal. They're great that you can see through them. They have a kind of permeable character to them. Plantings and trays. And so you move through these landscapes, and you would move through the canal. And now, one of the consultants we also took on board was Guy Nordenson. He's a very well-known structural engineer, one of the most creative structural engineers that I know of out of New York, who'd also been working previously with Mary, brought him on board, and developed this very unique bridge which had no rails. It was a bridge that had inverted beams that you could actually walk in. So that's your structure, a 140-foot span over the canal. These fins here act as the way of keeping you from falling into the canal. And then, of course, you can walk on the top or you can walk below. And because it's less than 30 inches, you don't need rails. So it's a very kind of defamiliarizing element in the landscape that helps you decompress, helps you rethink the way in which you engage nature. And now you're doing it 25 feet in the air in the woods. And then drawings, we did quite a few renderings with my colleague Kelly Wilson, who at the time was teaching at Harvard. He's now the head of the Design Center in Columbus, Indiana with IU. I encourage you to get down there and see him. He's a great thinker, and I think will do great things in Columbus. But he made these wonderful drawings that were donated to the museum. And then moving over the canal as part of that experience. And then into the trees. And of course, you're all wrapped in this sort of mesh metal, so it creates this, this moire patterns of nature, and a cacophony of light and shadow. And you can begin to see it branches off. It has little eddies in it, little nodes in which you can view into the trees and begin to get snippets of the Experiential Center as you approach it. Now, the Experiential Center is, as I said, is something, a figure carved at the edge of the wetlands, and you don't enter below, you actually enter from the top. So you engage a reflecting pool, a zero-edge reflecting pool that begins to merge with the view of the lake here. And Ed developed a series of rain gardens, again, this whole idea of water and how it flows, and then how water from the side is taken through these rain waters and then redeposited in the lake. And then we carved out the mound, providing services in the mound of bathrooms and things for park visitors, and that wraps around into a plaza that then sets you up to go inside the nymphaeum, into this cave-like space, which I'll talk about in a minute. So here's just a piece of the model as it terminates, or the walkway as it terminates into the shallow reflecting pool. It's a mirror to the sky, as you can see here. And what you see just below the water are a series of figures. And these figures are actually skylights. And they bring light from above down into this shadowy place, this underbelly of the site. And these figures are not merely skylights, though. They are actually extended in the Z direction to form columns or vessels of light. They begin to articulate the space, much like a stalactite would in a cave. And so that light bounces around in here. There's an air plenum floor, which you can blow air through to keep the constant temperature year-round, as that of a cave, around in the 54 to 65 degree area, so no matter whether it's the summer or the winter. And then, of course, this is carved out. This is board-formed concrete, and then the columns are made out of a plaster over aluminum, and the ceiling plaster too. So you get this kind of wet effect, and then the mound and carved in with the walkway back around. So this is cutting crossways through the mound and some of the views you get from up above. And then being down inside, and we went so far as to actually even make a mock-up. I have to say that one of the great assets to this project and to our team was Hagerman, GDH, contractors, Kent Foreman's here, Brent, Chad, David, a whole host of folks that were, again, I've never worked with a contractor in Indiana, much less a real contractor. Where I'm at, we're usually managing them or working with small town guys. These guys are fantastic. I know there are other good firms. We help participate in that process of qualifying. They did a fantastic job all the way through this process and ultimately in getting the thing built. So you grope your way through, and this is what I call tonal space, a space of zenithal light, where light is, you don't understand the source, it's more shadow than light. As you cut through linearly, you can see that there is a ramp that takes you up through the forest of columns, and then you arrive onto a higher plane. So there's actually the columns change sizes because proportionally they have to correct themselves as the 15-foot high space becomes 9.5-foot high space, a kind of Mesian space, more about the horizontal. So you start with a more vertical space and wind up in more horizontal space. And the column came about through a study of columns in architecture, in particular those of Alvar Aalto of Finland, but also looking at things like the hind legs of an animal or the roots of a plant or stalactites, minerals, vegetables, matter. And so they're not structural. They're really vessels of light, and they transmit air, and then they allow for views from here that you can look up through and see the sky. So the ground and the sky are connected through these volumes. And then the structure actually, as shown in these diagrams, bypasses the columns. The columns are ordered not on a structural rationale, but on light and how light moves across the site. And so they kind of switch and move to create a kind of dynamic of light and shadow. Here are the columns that we discovered, and we went to Finland, found these wonderful columns in a headquarters for a newspaper. And you can see the evolution of the column through the project, where we started here and a slow genealogy or evolution into the final column. And we did a mock-up on site. We started that, and it was all pretty amazing. Of course, at night they would be lit below the surface of the water, creating their own kind of play and delight in the evening as well as during the day. And you get a sense of this cave-like mouth of the cave and then coming out on the other side of the cave, arriving on these little platforms. And this is a metal grate, much like the walkway, but it's over a cistern, which actually feeds the water up above, which will, of course, evaporates, and then it's replenished by the cistern here, which is replenished by the site water, the gray water of the site. So this idea of the cave, the idea of refuge and prospect as a transition into the site as this extended threshold. Pure experience. And then just some very quick images of how we imagine that might be. Moving through the columns and then coming on the other side with the view out to the lake and then on out onto the site. And of course, that would be the sort of landing area for you. And Ed developed, like I was showing earlier, rain gardens and sculpture and fountains and everything that further, we're talking about right in here, that further animated the edge of the lake. And it was part of that Pathway Journeys. Now, the other part of the site, this location here, is for the Interpretation Center. And that was a real challenge. And I've got to tell you, the first time I showed what I wanted to do, I had this brilliant idea. We're going to do a glass box in the woods. And I drew the glass box, just like, say, Mies would draw it. And I showed it to Ed and Mary. Neither are architects, but who are much smarter than architects, I think, in New York. And they looked at it, and they wanted to be very nice. And they leaned over, and they finally said, Marlon, this has already been done. So they immediately shot down my Farnsworth House idea that Mies had done about 50 years ago. And they really said, you really need to tap into what you've already been working on in the park, this experiential, and find the expressive character and this idea about phenomena and bring that to bear on the interpretation. Because the interpretation can also be enhanced by another type of experience as well. So I went back to the drawing board and invigorated, because I know there's nothing worse than, nothing better than having honest criticism on your work, and especially from people that you really respect and value. So I'm so sad that these drawings aren't quite looking right. So we went back. This is part of switching from PC to Mac, I think. But Ed went back. I went back to the drawing board, and sort of relooked at how we might develop something for this site here. And the thought was, this is Eric drawing, is looking at all this log, this kind of wet, fecund site that we were given in this little triangular area, how we could remove the logs, make a place for this to nestle in or in and around the trees. And again, we're in the floodplain. And one of the things the first thing that I found on my first walk with Brent Waller, when Ed and I came for our first visit to Indianapolis, we did a death march in August around the park. I was sweating like a pig. Mosquitoes were attacking us. Brett was impervious to all of it. He was just so happy we're there to kind of look at this place. Ed never sweated. I think it's part of being in Mississippi and wearing seersucker suits a lot. But I found this leaf. It's a big leaf, as big as your hand. I think it's a maple leaf or an oak leaf. I'm not sure. What is sycamore? Thank you. You're right. It is a sycamore. And I picked it up and I held it to the sky, and Ed photographed it. And I said, isn't that interesting, this sort of beautiful structure, but it's so porous, so light. And I had my sketchbook, and I just slipped it in a sketchbook and folded it. And I never thought about it again until a year and a half, nearly 2 years later, when I had my butt kicked by my first critique, and went back and kind of laid it out in the office and started looking at it and seeing maybe there's an idea here. So, two, I come from a place where, there are other types of ways that light is filtered through things like the idea of a man-made structure that has aged over time, and this idea, again, of a building that is almost like foliage. And so I began to think about that. I began to think just about the light in the forest, and that tree reminded me of that, how light dappled through the canopy of the forest, and how cool shade is when it's ventilated. In the South, you get a lot of these big porches, but if they don't have a way of ventilating, it can be very hot. And that's why even if it's hot in the forest, if you have shade and a slight breeze, it ventilates through the canopy. And it's just something that nature provides us. So looking at these as sources of inspiration and as analogs, we came up with a simple structure that would fold upon itself with an exoskeleton, but would be very permeable. And these are just very early drawings, and that they would work together. They would fold in on themselves and create a wonderful deck or platform that rises out of the floodplain, because you had to get out of the floodplain in order to build, based on the Corps of Engineers argument. So ramps would take you extensions of the walkway and rise on these mounds, or some way of getting you up. Actually, there were no mounds at the time. This deck, and then these canopies would fold over and create these wonderful outdoor spaces, and really a kind of central plaza, place of gathering. There's a classroom here. They had another type of educational space, a gallery, services for people in the park, kitchen, bathrooms, that sort of thing. So as you can see by now, there's a vision beginning to emerge for the entire park. The bridge, the pathway journeys through the park, the Experiential Center, the interpretive, things it's just phenomenal. And every step of the way, it's just, we're provided with the encouragement and the vision of the museum to keep moving forward. So we're very close on some of these projects to getting the drawings done. Things are moving along in a pretty amazing way. The engineers beginning to really do their calculations. We brought on very good at mechanical, electrical engineers, CRIPE, civil engineering involved. And then I'm in the desert in Mali, in West Africa, with several architect friends of mine had decided we wanted to go to a place that hadn't yet been bulldozed by Western society. And that was Mali, and the place of Timbuktu and the Dogon. And of course, we all have iPhones. And this is 2008, and the beginning of the decline in the economy. And my phone rings. I'm sitting around a campfire. And I answer I couldn't believe somebody called me in the desert, and I'm in West Africa. We were there for a month. And it's Max Anderson. And Max says, I've got some bad news or sad news. I'm really heavy heart. We're not going to be able to realize the whole vision for this park. And it was absolutely stunning to hear that. And we're going to have to recalibrate and rethink what we do there. And I had another 2 weeks in Africa to think about it before I got back here, and didn't know what to do. It was just sort of very disappointed, and it's like, what are we going to do? And so came back, and Ed and I and Mary had new conversations with them, and in particular, there's a recalibration on the pathway journeys and what we can do in the park, getting the artist on board, which have now been engaged, and of course our contractor as well. And the idea was to take the language. The experiential and the bridge just were not going to be possible. There was feelings it might be too aggressive for the park. There were other feelings about the scope had increased too much. There were with the economy in decline, the funding concerns, there was a lot of criteria. So they felt it best to do something more appropriate to the times. And they said, well, can you do this interpretive center for half the size and half the cost? And foolishly, I said yes. We could do it for half the size, but not half the cost. That doesn't quite work that way. But they said, we'd like to at least have this beautiful pavilion in the woods to be a respite, to be a place where people can come to. And so we took that on as a new challenge, as Ed took on the new challenge of rethinking the park, and went back to the drawing board. Again, you have to understand where they want. Max and Lisa said, keep the language. We love that, but let's figure out how to do one of these instead of three. So again, I apologize. So Ed went back and thought of a whole new way to enter the park with this beautiful grove of trees around this rotunda here, vehicle drop-off. Of course, you now have the art here, a whole new entry sequence in using the bridge, or as opposed to the bridge here. Now we use this bridge, and then in the future, another bridge, hopefully, will be constructed here to create a kind of loop. And then our project would still be going into the same site. But we still had to deal with the practicalities of how we get it out of the floodplain. Here's some of the art, of course, with Team A put into it. Plaza that Ed reintroduced that as an alternative to the rain gardens and things he had provided for at the edge. Of course, the towpath and how that would be reconsidered at the edge as well. And just simple figures of the bridges that Eric Fulford worked with us on, and this pathway into the trees. And I really feel in retrospect the scaling down of the Interpretive Center is a good thing. If you've been out on the site, it's really good scale. I think we might have had it too big in the place it was going to be. So when things happen like this, you rise to the challenge and you move forward. And that's exactly what we've done. So here's the site. Once again, here it is underwater. What do? Well, Ed came up with an idea of, rather than raising the building on stilts, because we had to pull it 5 feet, which the original information we had was not correct. So rather than pull it 3 feet, we had to pull it 5 feet out of the forest floor. So you can imagine a building sitting on stilts at eye level. Not very appetizing. So it's like looking underneath the pants leg there. So what Ed came up with is a series of figured mounds that the building would sit on, like Indian mounds. It would rise naturally out of the floor of the forest, and those points would direct you to particular views through the trees. And this was the first sketch that he sent us. And the guys in my office just flipped out. They thought he was on drugs. They really did think he was Keith Richards there for a moment. And said, what in the hell is he thinking? And we studied it for days because, it looked like hieroglyphics to us. but we kept looking at it, and then it started making all this amazing sense about how water flowed through the site. It could flow and be channeled underneath the building, how the mounds rise, and with them rise the ramps gently onto this elevated floor area, how they would respond to this purple line, which is the canopy above, to create an edge with the figure. So another figure and edge, and this outdoor space being more articulated. And it just made so much sense, this kind of really a land art being used to situate the building and be useful, take it out of the floodplain. So very simply, we had this idea then that the pathway would become a deck, and that deck would fold up and around and become a canopy. So one material, one detail. How would that be done? The other strategy was, how would we engage it? How would a visitor come here? Is it an object in the landscape? Is it of the landscape? What if it starts to operate somewhere in between? We were here one time, and we took this photograph, John Bolkins, in my office, and then we enlarged it further, and here are the deer, this sort of stealth relationship of nature to nature. And could we make a building that would begin to have a stealthy relationship, and then you discover it in your nearness with it, in much the way to discover the sort of the tactility and the textures and patterns of nature in your nearness with it in the forest. So you engage, I think, the building in a very sort of quiet, sublime sort of way. It's certainly not jumping out at you. It decides to be horizontal in the midst of a vertical structure. And looking closer to this whole idea of the pavilion, we again wanted to develop a surface that could have a porosity to it that would allow water and light to go right through the building, right back into the site. But also to filter the light, to restructure the light. And we found out that one of the root words of pavilion is the papillon, the butterfly. And we looked at microscopic structure of a butterfly wing and found, again, relationships. And so that becomes a kind of analog of how we work. But we needed a structure to hold this up, much like the butterfly, much like the leaf. So we allowed Guy to think carefully about an exoskeleton with a substructure that would hold 2x4 members of Ipe, which I like to call ironwood up here, rot resistance with a fire rating of concrete. You know, wood and steel building that would be essentially fireproofed here in the woods. So that's the idea of the exoskeleton. And this is how we do animation. In my firm, it's very sophisticated. So there it is, one idea, and back. I'm glad to do it again for you if you missed it. So all one material, folded up and around, and in between, sandwiched in between, is the program. And very simple notion. And this would provide shade. It would provide ventilated shade, a place to get out of the sun, and an air-conditioned space for those that needed it, or bathrooms, that sort of thing. So really just a nice respite in the wood. And then, of course, this was the ultimate result of that. But it went further because you have to be able to, think about how you put it together, what the net effects are materially and spatially. So we thought very carefully about the details, the members of the wood and how that would fold up and then over. But we had to come up with a way to walk on this and still provide light and opportunity for light and water to come through the deck, but still meet the codes. So we came up with an idea. We did several mock-ups in Arkansas with a deck that would use 1x2 acrylic bars, UV rated, in between the spacing. We looked at solid wood, we looked at translucent, we looked at clear, and that would then be the horizontal walking surface, and then would fall out once it went vertical and then over your head as a canopy. And so we did all these tests. The museum was great in supporting us to do this because they wanted to work, they wanted the vision to be complete It had to be more than just architecture. It had to bridge the gap between architecture, art, land, and nature. So we got it passed by the codes, and there it is, right there, the final product. And then a demonstration of how it could be lit at night. Now we have lighting under it right now, but it's more pointillist in our. This is something when y'all get a new director, I'm talking to the museum now, I want to talk about. We know a simple way to light this up at night, to let it really truly be an apparition in the woods from below. And of course, it still allows for the light and shadow during the day to go through it. We have the spotlights right now, but this is a more even light that's, I think, very simple to do. And Eric Fulford, who's a landscape architect, but really a really smart guy with lighting, who worked a lot with us on the lighting for the building, too, had this brilliant idea of these kind of flexible light tubes that you could run underneath the edges as well. I just like this photograph of Eric. I think it's great. Eric, as you know, is not well. I hope if you know Eric, you'll get by and see him. I had spent 2 hours with him today. He's full of energy and life right now, and I think if you do know Eric, he's an amazing talent that you have here in Indianapolis, and I would spend some time with him. He's a great person. So we developed some drawings. This kind of shows you the layers with the exoskeleton, the wood liner in between, the substructure, and of course then the programmatic box, the glass box, and then the charcoal box. Guy Nordenson. Now this structure is in these oculi that allow more intense light and water to come through. Also allow for people to come up the other way to clean the leaves off, the skylights and the leaves off the wood, so it has a pragmatic purpose as well. That's Guy Nordenson testing it out for the first time. I was afraid that he would fall through, but trust me, I think you could land a plane on the top of this thing, or at least a helicopter. We went so far as to look at bark. We wondered how our columns, which are analogous to trees, could begin to appear and disappear in the wood. So we had Eric get out there and get all this bark and match paint to each of the bark, and then the most prevalent color in the bark is what we chose for the painting of the steel and the columns. And if you go out there, you'll notice sometimes they tend to just dissolve and come back. And this is an old trick that Fay Jones, who was a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright, a friend and mentor of mine, would do with a lot with his steel structures and wood structures in Arkansas. And so we just kind of carried that forward here. And so as heavy as that structure is, what you experience primarily is only its shadow, the ephemeralness of shadow and light through the screen. A winter view. Of course, we took big solid chunks of Indiana limestone and carved them to make this serpentine bench that's part of the paving. I think I can take that back. Yeah, part of a limestone patio terrace here. So a little material culture there, local culture. And as I said, this oculi was really important. This is something we got to introduce that wasn't in the project before. On the second time around, we got to think about how light and water and access could work. We looked at various patterns. And this isn't a matter of just punching through the system. We actually had to pleat the system to change the spacing just enough to allow for this figure to emerge in the surface of the canopy. And it really contributes, I think, to the variability of light and pattern. This is while we're using a geothermal system, it's also can be cooled by summer winds. You can see how it situates itself in the site to accommodate that. The intensity of blues, that's the intensity of the amount of porosity in the surface of water that can go through and back into the aquifer. And one of the phenomena, this is clearly a part rendering, part photo, but we wanted to try to illustrate a phenomena that happened. Kent used to tell me a little bit about it, or maybe it was Brent. that the workers, when they were working on this, with this oculi were formed. When it would rain, they would stop working, and they would just stand on the deck because the rain would come through in the shape of the parallelogram. And everything else around it, there's very little rain getting through. It's just getting through in drips, whereas this is pouring through in a cascade in a parallelogram shape. So another figure that emerges here in the park. I think I have not witnessed this myself, but I hope to be here sometime when it does. You have some of your monsoons here that you do have, and see how this works. But we tried to illustrate it as best we could from what the workers had told us. And of course, the light, as the rain starts to taper off, shining through that, then there's a whole nother effect that begins to take place. So we're shaping light, shaping phenomena. And here you can see how that pattern creates its own density and opacity. And I think it's very key, too, to know that the building floats just above the mounds, but that mound, as I pointed out earlier, is actually a trough for which floodwaters can slide through. Here's the flood level right here of the 100-year flood. And then the whole approach with the ramps that move up along top of the mounds. And probably my favorite photo of all the photos that we have of this, of the clear vitrine, the charcoal box, the canopy, the deck, nature all converging together. Now this black box really is the services, the mechanical room, the bathrooms, the kitchen and office for an attendant in the park. The floor inside and the wood inside is all white oak. It's been water popped, we sponged it, and then we ebonized it to have this slightly polished look, much like a piece of this museum broke off and came down into the woods. And then, of course, the rest of the wood that you see, the ipe, will turn silver over time. So you get this raw kind of liner with this insertion that's slightly more cooked, slightly more finished. Having some fun with reflections here. And the box is actually, if you didn't know this, is charred wood. So we used a Japanese process of charring the wood with a flame and then sealing it with a Brazilian nut oil called pinafin that you do once a year. And that creates an iridescence in the wood and fire retards the wood. So you char it on all sides, and then we make a rain screen out of it. So this wood acts as a kind of dark, sort of abstract box set amongst the trees, and of course, lit at the top and bottom, so it sort of elevates. And then what has come to my attention is this interstitial zone between the box, the independence and the autonomy of the box and the wrapper, this space. I think Mark told me somebody got engaged here not too long ago, and maybe starting a whole new phenomena in the park as a place to this sort of, I don't know, maybe there's something sexual about it. I'm not sure, but great place to be engaged. Maybe it'll eventually become weddings will be part of the program. I know when Mark and I were out here last September at Mary Miss's opening, he was telling me about this, and then we walked up into the lily garden, and somebody just was proposing there too. So there's something about your place here that's getting the love thing going on. So here's just some parting shots. So, I really hope that in many ways what's been provided here, adds to the life of the park and, evolves itself in terms of how it's programmed, how effects like this can be achieved. Of course, the killer shot here. I don't know how many were here on opening day. We came for opening day 2 years ago. I think there were, I told 10,000 people showed up for the park. It was really fantastic. We had this great dinner. I think it's at St. Elmo's with many members of the team. You see Mark and Lisa and Eric and Mary and some of the members of my team, Ed Blake. Sadly, Ed Blake died in September of 2010, just 2 days before he was going to be in the park to see it for the first time finished, which was, I think, really sad, tragic. I know that it was something that he was deeply passionate about. He was my collaborator for 10 years. It's like losing a big brother. I still mourn Ed, but he was a big part of this process, a great inspiration as much as anything else that I've mentioned, and a confidant in the good and the tough times of this process. But this was a great time. This is a time I'll never forget. This is coming towards the end of the project. And of course, opening day as the sun is setting and people are still celebrating. And of course, this most recent award. I also want to add that I had the good fortune this year to win one of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Awards, and part of that acknowledgement is an exhibit in New York. And so currently the building, among other buildings in our office, are on display at the American Academy. And first of all, I would just like to end by saying thank you once again to the Indianapolis Museum of Art and to our amazing design team, all the people that I've mentioned and those that I haven't. Lakey, so MEP consulting firm, was great here. And by the way, we just got LEED certified, so you're happy to know that. Or I'm happy to know that. It's a long process. Our first LEED certified building, so it's pretty exciting. I think what we try to do here is provide a rich spatial encounter that could only be achieved through architecture, and one which acts as a framework for experiencing its place, one which is not symbolic, but is in fact an extension of the place. And I hope it speaks to the value of architecture, something that is uniquely different from nature and art, but yet can serve as an interpretation of those things. Thank you very much.